Hello everybody, welcome back to Brainstorm Lore, and welcome to the early history of Lord of the Rings, The Years of the Trees, Part 2. By now, you've no doubt noticed the genealogy chart occupying the screen. I'm afraid you're going to have to get used to this chart because in addition to being the early history of the elves, this video will be talking about the events and circumstances that caused the race of elves in Middle-earth to split apart into their various different kindreds and tribes. Because in addition to inventing just about every other major trope that modern fantasy seeks to rip off in some way or another, Mr. Tolkien is singularly responsible for creating what I like to call the Rainbow Elf Palette, or REP for short. You know how in a lot of modern fantasy, especially post-Dungeons & Dragons fantasy, that while in most such universes humans are just humans and dwarves are just dwarves, but elves come in multiple different varieties, like high elves, dark elves, wood elves, etc., ad nauseum, that's the Rainbow Elf Palette. Anyway, back to the story. In the previous episode, I mentioned how the Valar had discovered the elves just before deciding to finally give Melkor the beating he deserved and then sentencing him to a very, very, very long time in essentially God prison. For this episode, let's go back an indeterminate but presumably short length of time to before the elves were discovered by the Vala Orome on the shores of the Bay of Cuivienen. According to their own legend, the elves were first awakened by the creator Eru Ilúvatar himself. The first of the elves to awaken were three married pairs, and their names literally mean in Elvish first, second, and third. There was Imin and his wife Iminye, then Tata and his wife Tatye, and finally Enel and his wife Enelye. After waking, these six first elves wandered off into the forest, where they happened upon, each in turn, three different groups of sleeping elves. It's here that we see the very first division of the elves into different kindreds. The first group of 12 elves was claimed by Imin for his people, the second group of 18 by Tata, and finally the third group of 24 by Enel. Imin, aware that his clan was the smallest, and noticing that every successive group of elves they encountered was larger than the previous, decided to try and be clever. When they came across a group of 36 elves just sitting around staring at the stars, he allowed Tata to claim them for his clan. Then, when they encountered a group of 48 elves singing, albeit without words, they were claimed by Enel. Unfortunately for Imin, they didn't find any more elves after this, so his clan, known later as the Minyar, remained the smallest at 14, compared to the Tatyar's 56 and the Nelyar's 74. This means that Ilúvatar originally created 144 elves, and now they were all awake. As a result of this, 12 became a very important number to the elves and became the basis of their mathematics, sort of like how number 10 is for us. Unfortunately for the first elves, Orome was not the first Valar to find out where they were. That honor belonged to Melkor. However, instead of trying to destroy them, as you might have expected him to, Melkor instead decided to try and mess with the elves. He knew that Orome, the huntsman of the Valar, was looking for them, among other things, and so, by secret means, he spread a rumor among them of a rider who caught any who strayed from the group and carried them off into the darkness. As a result, when Orome happened upon Cuivienen and found the elves there, several of them were afraid of him and ran off into the forest. These unfortunate few, in fact, were captured and carried off by the servants of Melkor and imprisoned within his great dark fortress of Utumno. And it was then, in the words of Saruman from the Fellowship of the Ring, that Melkor tortured and mutilated his new captives, turning them into the first orcs. The Silmarillion describes this as the most heinous of Melkor's many, many misdeeds. Given that the average orc in Tolkien's Legendarium is ugly, wicked, and vile, while the average elf is tall, noble, and fair, it's not that hard to see why. Melkor had taken something that was wonderful and beautiful and had perverted it into a twisted and hideous mirror of itself. Fortunately, the majority of the elves did not run away, and when Orome started talking to them, they realized that this strange godlike being on his magnificent horse meant them no harm. It was after this meeting that Orome hurried back to Valinor and told the other Valar of what he'd found, which resulted in them going north, defeating Melkor and imprisoning him. With this done, the Valar then set about to deciding what to do with the elves. Some, most notably Ulmo, the Lord of Waters, felt that the elves should remain where they were and decide their own destiny. But the majority of the Valar disagreed. Melkor was defeated, but many of his servants had escaped the battle and were still at large, and it was feared that they might work some harm or mischief upon the elves. And so the Valar decided that they would extend an invitation to the elves to invite as many as would willingly come to live with them in the undying lands of Aman. With the matter settled, Orome returned to Cuiviénen and presented the Valar's offer to the elves. However, the elves were nervous. When the Valar had battled Melkor and his allies, they had seen the northern skies burn with fire and felt the ground shake beneath their feet. These Valar were clearly beings of godlike power. Might they not also be dangerous? In the end, the elves settled on a compromise. Each clan would select a representative to go with Orome to Valinor. They would then return, and based on their testimony, the elves would decide whether to stay or go. Soon the 3 representatives were chosen: Ingwe for the Minyar, Finwë for the Tatyar, and Elwë for the Nelyar. All 3 elves followed Orome to Valinor, and when they returned, their testimony was so positive and glowing that most of the elves chose to accept the Valar's invitation. All of Ingwe's clan chose to follow him, as did half of Finwë's and the majority of Elwë's. Those who refused to go became known as the Avari, or the Unwilling, and simply disappear from history and are never really mentioned again. The elves that did decide to go to Valinor, named the Eldar by Orome, were so impressed, in fact, that they decided to give their clans new names and to claim each of the 3 representatives that had gone to Valinor to be their respective kings. So, Ingwe was made king of the Vanyar, or Fair Elves, Finwë was acclaimed king of the Noldor, or Deep Elves, and Elwë was made king of the Teleri, or Singers. And so, the great journey began. Though perhaps journey may be a bit misleading, as the word implies an urgency that, based on my own reading of the Silmarillion, doesn't seem to be present. In many ways, this migration was more akin to a road trip. Yes, the elves wanted to get to Valinor, but they were also taken in by a lot of the new places and things that they were seeing. And they, especially the Teleri, were in no great rush to reach the western coast. After all, apart from the 3 kings, this was the first time that any elf had seen any part of the world beyond Cuiviénen. The Silmarillion doesn't really describe how long the great journey lasted. After all, there was neither sun nor moon back then, and since the light of the 2 trees didn't extend beyond Aman, the elves made the entire journey by starlight. For the first leg of the trip, Orome led the elves along the northern shore of the Sea of Helkar, just south of the Iron Mountains. At one point, they passed by the ruins of Utumno, Melkor's great fortress. Apparently, some elves were so frightened by the sight of the place that they ran away and were never heard from again. At this point, those of you familiar only with The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings are probably wondering where exactly in Middle-earth we are at this point. A fair question, given that by the War of the Ring, the Iron Mountains and the Sea of Helkar no longer existed. This also holds true for Beleriand, a region of Middle-earth west of both the Shire and the Blue Mountains that would sink beneath the waves at the end of the First Age. However, it's around this point that we finally start to come across some familiar landmarks. The elves passed through the Great Forest, later known as Mirkwood Forest. Back then it was a lot brighter and had fewer giant spiders. And also crossed the great river Anduin, where the One Ring would be lost by Isildur and later rediscovered by Gollum. The elves didn't really encounter any serious roadblocks until they reached the Misty Mountains, which back then were much, much taller and harder to cross. So the elves had to stop and wait for a while Orome made a path for them through the mountains. But at last the elves passed safely through the Misty Mountains, exiting at the spot where later would be built the town of Rivendell. Continuing westward through the lands that would later become known as the Shire, the elves crossed over the Blue Mountains and through Beleriand, and finally beheld the western shores of the ocean. There Ulmo, Vala of the Waters, awaited them, ready to escort them the final leg of the journey to Valinor. He did this by using a floating island called Tall Eressëa as a ferry of sorts. One by one, each of the elven clans would get aboard, and he would tow the island across the ocean until they reached the shores of Aman. And so, one by one, the 3 elven clans completed the journey to the undying lands of Aman. Sort of. It's around here that I feel I have to pause the story briefly to talk about these 3 different kindreds of the elven race, what they were like and how they differed from one another. Let's start with the Vanyar, the followers of Ingwe, the smallest group of elves and the very first to make the crossing. Of the 3 elven kindreds, the Vanyar are arguably the least interesting. They were the first to arrive in Valinor because they were the most eager to complete the journey. After all, unlike the other 2, their decision to go to Valinor was unanimous. They're mostly known for having golden hair and for being really good at poetry. After arriving in Valinor, the Vanyar quickly became the favorites of the Valar, and especially of Manwë and Varda, their leaders. The most prominent example of this was the fact that Ingwe was named High King of all the elves. In fact, his full name, Ingwe Ingweron, literally means Chief of Chieftains. After a while, the Vanyar stopped interacting with their fellow elves almost completely, and spent all their time sitting in the halls of Manwë conversing with the king of the Valar. As a result, apart from participating in the War of Wrath at the very end of the First Age, the Vanyar do nothing throughout the course of Tolkien's history except make nice with the gods. For this reason, I refer to them as the goody-two-shoes elves. Next, let's talk about the Teleri, the third and largest group of elves, and the ones that straggled the most over the course of the Great Journey. This is mainly because, of the 3 elven groups, the Teleri were the most enamored with the beauty of Middle-earth, and the most reluctant to leave it for the undying lands of Aman. Some were so reluctant, in fact, that during the crossing of the great river Anduin, an elf known only as Lenwë, and any who chose to follow him, turned aside from the journey, and instead marched south to live along the banks of the Anduin. These elves became known as the Nandor, and they would be separated from their fellow elves for many centuries to come. Meanwhile, the rest of the Teleri, under the leadership of their new king Elwë, crossed the Anduin and the Misty Mountains, and soon made their way to West Beleriand. And it was there that a second splintering occurred. Elwë, you see, was a very good friend of Finwë, the king of the Noldor elves, and it was not uncommon for him to leave his own people for a time and walk through the woods to the Noldor encampment to speak with his friend. Then, on one fateful starlit night shortly before the elves reached the coast, Elwë was making just such a trip through the woods to speak to Finwë when he stumbled upon a clearing in the woods and saw a stunningly beautiful woman. Her name was Melian, and she was one of the Maiar, the lesser spirits that served the Valar. Apparently it was love at first sight for the elf king and the lesser goddess. It's kind of hard to describe what happened next, so I'm just going to refer to the Silmarillion for this one. Quote, "She spoke no word, but being filled with love, Elwë came to her, and took her hand, and straightway a spell was laid on him, so that they stood thus, while long years were measured by the wheeling stars above them, and the trees of Non-Elmoth grew tall and dark, before they spoke any word. Thus Elwë's folk who sought him found him not." End quote. Essentially, Elwë went missing for a very long time, and the Teleri were split on how to proceed next. That split soon became literal, as a good chunk of the Teleri refused to continue the journey without their king. These remained behind in Middle-earth and were known as the Sindar, or Grey Elves, because they had not refused the journey, but also had never seen the lights of the 2 trees of Valinor. Eventually, Elwë would reappear, with Melian, now his wife, at his side. But by then he had abandoned any idea of continuing the journey to the Undying Lands. And so he and the Sindar settled down in Beleriand and established an elven kingdom there. In times to come, Elwë would be more commonly known by the name of Elu Thingol, Lord Greymantle. Those Teleri that wished to continue the journey without Elwë did so under the leadership of his younger brother Olwë. And at last they arrived on the coast, but by then the Vanyar and the Noldor had already gone on ahead of them on the floating island of Tall Eressëa. And so Olwë and his followers were left cooling their heels on the shoreline to await Ulmo's return. But the wait was not a lonely one. One of the ocean Maiar, named Osse, befriended Olwe and his followers and taught them everything he knew of the sea, its creatures, and its beauties. As a result, Olwe and his people fell in love with the sea and named themselves the Falmari, or Sea Elves. Time passed, and finally Ulmo returned with Tol Eressëa. The elves boarded the floating island, and Ulmo began towing them back across the seas to Valinor, much to the sadness of Osse, who had become great friends with Olwe's people and wanted them to stay. The journey was mostly uneventful, but as Tol Eressëa came in sight of Aman itself, Olwe and his people realized that they were not yet ready to leave behind their beloved ocean, not even for the light of the two trees, and they prevailed upon Ulmo to stop. Ulmo agreed, setting Tol Eressëa in place in the Bay of Eldamar just off the coast of Aman, and making it so that the island would never float away again. The other Valar were none too pleased with Ulmo's decision, but he, unsurprisingly, understood the Teleri's love of his watery realm and was sympathetic to their wishes. In the end, the Valar compromised and made a great cleft in the mountains surrounding Valinor, both to allow the Vanyar and Noldor see the stars that all elves love, and also to allow the Teleri to at least see the light of the two trees. Olwe and his followers lived there for some time, but at last their desire to see the light of the trees began to outweigh even their love of the ocean. But how could they complete the journey now that the island they lived on was fixed in place? It was then that their old friend, the Maia Osse, came to them and taught them how to build the first ships. As a final gift, Osse then sent a fleet of swans to pull the boats across the final stretch of water, and so, at long last, the Teleri set foot on the shores of the Undying Lands. It was there that they would build the great harbor city of Aqualonde, the haven of swans, and would ever after carve the prows of their ships in the shape of swans in remembrance. The great journey was finally complete. And what of the Noldor, the second tribe of elves? Well, I'm afraid that will have to wait for next week's video. This is because in the events to come, they, and especially the family of their new king Finwë, will take center stage. Next week, the Noldor and the making of the Silmarils. Until then. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, comment, subscribe, and check out our website at studiobrainstorm.net. And if you have a story that you think is worth telling, we are more than happy to help you publish it. Thank you, and have a nice day.